Chapter 13. The Adventure of the Picardy Château. I looked up Eaucourt Sainte-Anne on the map, and the more I studied its position, the less I liked it. It was the knot from which sprang all the main routes to our Picardy front. If the Boche ever broke us, it was the place for which old Hindenburg would make. At all hours, troops and transport trains were moving through that insignificant hamlet. Eminent generals and their staffs passed daily within sight of the château. It was a convenient halting place for battalions coming back to rest. Supposing, I argued, our enemies wanted a key spot for some assault upon the morale or the discipline or health of the British Army, they couldn't find a better than Eaucourt Sainte-Anne. It was the ideal centre of espionage. But when I guardedly sounded my friends of the intelligence, they didn't seem to be worrying about it. From them I got a chit to the local French authorities, and as soon as we came out of the line, towards the end of December, I made straight for the country town of Douvecourt. By a bit of luck our divisional quarters were almost next door. I interviewed a tremendous swell in a black uniform and black kid gloves, who received me affably and put his archives and registers at my disposal. By this time I talked French fairly well, having a natural turn for languages, but half the rapid speech of the sous-préfet was lost on me. By and by he left me with the papers and a clerk, and I proceeded to grub up the history of the château. It had belonged, since long before Agincourt, to the noble house of the d'Eaucourt, now represented by an ancient marquise who dwelt at Biarritz. She had never lived in the place, which a dozen years before had been falling to ruins, when a rich American leased it and partially restored it. He had soon got sick of it. His daughter had married a blackguard French cavalry officer with whom he quarrelled, said the clerk, and since then there had been several tenants. I wondered why a house so unattractive should have let so readily, but the clerk explained that the cause was the partridge shooting. It was about the best in France, and in 1912 had shown the record bag. The list of the tenants was before me. There was a second American, an Englishman called Halford, a Paris Jew banker, and an Egyptian prince. But the space for 1913 was blank, and I asked the clerk about it. He told me that it had been taken by a woolen manufacturer from Lille, but he had never shot the partridges, though he had spent occasional nights in the house. He had a 5 years' lease and was still paying rent to the marquise. I asked the name, but the clerk had forgotten. "It will be written there," he said. "But no," I said, "somebody must have been asleep over this register. There's nothing after 1912. He examined the page and blinked his eyes. Someone indeed must have slept. No doubt it was young Louis, who is now with the guns in Champagne. But the name will be on the commissary's list. It is, as I remember, a sort of Flemish." He hobbled off and returned in 5 minutes. "Bommaerts," he said, "Jacques Bommaerts. A young man with no wife but with money. Dieu de Dieu, what oceans of it!" That clerk got 25 francs and he was cheap at the price. I went back to my division with a sense of awe on me. It was a marvellous fate that had brought me by odd routes to this out-of-the-way corner. First, the accident of Hamilton seeing Gresson, then the night in the clearing station, last the mishap of Archie's plane getting lost in the fog. I had 3 grounds of suspicion: Gresson's sudden illness, the Canadian's ghost, and that horrid old woman in the dusk. And now I had one tremendous fact. The place was leased by a man called Bommaerts, and that was one of the 2 names I had heard whispered in that far-away cleft in the Coolin by the stranger from the sea. A sensible man would have gone off to the contre-espionage people and told them his story. I couldn't do this. I felt that it was my own private find, and I was going to do the prospecting myself. Every moment of leisure I had, I was puzzling over the thing. I rode round by the château one frosty morning and examined all the entrances. The main one was the grand avenue with the locked gates. That led straight to the front of the house where the terrace was, or you might call it the back, for the main door was on the other side. Anyhow, the drive came up to the edge of the terrace and then split into 2, one branch going to the stables by way of the outbuildings where I had seen the old woman, the other circling round the house, skirting the moat, and joining the back road just before the bridge. If I had gone to the right instead of the left that first evening with Archie, I should have circumnavigated the place without any trouble. Seen in the fresh morning light, the house looked commonplace enough. Part of it was as old as Noah, but most was newish and jerry-built, the kind of flat-chested, thin French chateau, all front and no depth, and full of draughts and smoky chimneys. I might have gone in and ransacked the place, but I knew I should find nothing. It was borne in on me that it was only when evening fell that that house was interesting, and that I must come, like Nicodemus, by night. Besides, I had a private account to settle with my conscience. I had funked the place in the foggy twilight, and it does not do to let a matter like that slide. A man's courage is like a horse that refuses a fence. You have got to take him by the head and cram him at it again. If you don't, he will funk worse next time. I hadn't enough courage to be able to take chances with it. Though I was afraid of many things, the thing I feared most mortally was being afraid. I did not get a chance till Christmas Eve. The day before there had been a fall of snow, but the frost set in, and the afternoon ended in a green sunset with the earth crisp and crackling like a shark's skin. I dined early and took with me Geordie Hamilton, who added to his many accomplishments that of driving a car. He was the only man in the B.E.F. who guessed anything of the game I was after, and I knew that he was as discreet as a tombstone. I put on my oldest trench cap, slacks, and a pair of scaife-soled boots that I used to change into in the evening. I had a useful little electric torch which lived in my pocket, and from which a cord led to a small bulb of light that worked with a switch and could be hung on my belt. That left my arms free in case of emergencies. Likewise, I strapped on my pistol. There was little traffic in the hamlet of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne that night. Few cars were on the road, and the M.T. detachment, judging from the din, seemed to be busy on a private spree. It was about 9 o'clock when we turned into the side road, and at the entrance to it I saw a solid figure in khaki mounting guard beside two bicycles. Something in the man's gesture, as he saluted, struck me as familiar, but I had no time to hunt for casual memories. I left the car just short of the bridge and took the road which would bring me to the terraced front of the house. Once I turned the corner of the chateau and saw the long ghostly façade white in the moonlight, I felt less confident. The eeriness of the place smote me. In that still, snowy world it loomed up immense and mysterious, with its rows of shuttered windows, each with that air which empty houses have of concealing some wild story. I longed to have old Peter with me, for he was the man for this kind of escapade. I had heard that he had been removed to Switzerland, and I pictured him now in some mountain village where the snow lay deep. I would have given anything to have had Peter with a whole leg by my side. I stepped on the terrace and listened. There was not a sound in the world, not even the distant rumble of a cart. The pile towered above me like a mausoleum, and I reflected that it must take some nerve to burgle an empty house. It would be good enough fun to break into a bustling dwelling and pinch the plate when the folk were at dinner, but to burgle emptiness and silence meant a fight with the terrors in a man's soul. It was worse in my case, for I wasn't cheered with prospects of loot. I wanted to get inside chiefly to soothe my conscience. I hadn't much doubt I would find a way, for 3 years of war and the frequent presence of untidy headquarters staffs have loosened the joints of most Picardy houses. There's generally a window that doesn't latch, or a door that doesn't bar. But I tried window after window on the terrace without result. The heavy green sun shutters were down over each, and when I broke the hinges of one there was a long bar within to hold it firm. I was beginning to think of shinning up a rainpipe and trying the second floor, when a shutter I had laid hold on swung back in my hand. It had been left unfastened, and kicking the snow from my boots, I entered a room. A gleam of moonlight followed me, and I saw I was in a big salon with a polished wood floor and dark lumps of furniture swathed in sheets. I clicked the bulb at my belt, and the little circle of light showed a place which had not been dwelt in for years. At the far end was another door, and as I tiptoed towards it, something caught my eye on the parquet. It was a piece of fresh snow, like that which clumps on the heel of a boot. I had not brought it there. Some other visitor had passed this way, and not long before me. Very gently I opened the door and slipped in. In front of me was a pile of furniture which made a kind of screen. and behind that I halted and listened. There was somebody in the room. I heard the sound of human breathing and soft movements. The man, whoever he was at the far end from me, and though there was a dim glow of moon through a broken shutter, I could see nothing of what he was after. I was beginning to enjoy myself now. I knew of his presence, and he did not know of mine, and that is the sport of stalking. An unwary movement of my hand caused the screen to creak. Instantly the movement ceased, and there was utter silence. I held my breath, and after a second or two the tiny sounds began again. I had a feeling, though my eyes could not assure me, that the man before me was at work and was using a very small shaded torch. There was just the faintest moving shimmer on the wall beyond, though that might come from the crack of moonlight. Apparently he was reassured, for his movements became more distinct. There was a jar, as if a table had been pushed back. Once more there was silence, and I heard only the intake of breath. I have very quick ears, and to me it sounded as if the man was rattled. The breathing was quick and anxious. Suddenly it changed and became the ghost of a whistle, the kind of sound one makes with the lips and teeth without ever letting the tune break out clear. We all do it when we are preoccupied with something, shaving or writing letters or reading the newspaper. But I did not think my man was preoccupied. He was whistling to quiet fluttering nerves. Then I caught the air. It was cherry ripe. In a moment, from being hugely at my ease, I became the nervous one. I had been playing peep-boo with the unseen, and the tables were turned. My heart beat against my ribs like a hammer. I shuffled my feet, and again there fell the tense silence. "Mary," I said, and the words seemed to explode like a bomb in the stillness. "Mary, it's me, Dick Hannay." There was no answer but a sob and the sound of a timid step. I took 4 paces into the darkness and caught in my arms a trembling girl. Often in the last months I had pictured the kind of scene which would be the culminating point of my life. When our work was over and the war had been forgotten, somewhere, perhaps in a green Cotswold meadow or in a room of an old manor, I would talk with Mary. By that time we should know each other well, and I should have lost my shyness. I would try to tell her that I loved her, but whenever I thought of what I should say, my heart sank, for I knew I would make a fool of myself. You can't live my kind of life for 40 years wholly among men and be of any use at pretty speeches to women. I knew I should stutter and blunder, and I used despairingly to invent impossible situations where I might make my love plain to her without words, by some piece of melodramatic sacrifice. But the kind fates had saved me the trouble. Without a syllable save Christian names stammered in that eerie darkness, we had come to complete understanding. The fairies had been at work unseen, and the thoughts of each of us had been moving towards the other, till love had germinated like a seed in the dark. As I held her in my arms, I stroked her hair, and murmured things which seemed to spring out of some ancestral memory. Certainly my tongue had never used them before, nor my mind imagined them. By and by she slipped her arms round my neck, and with half a sob strained towards me. She was still trembling. "Dick," she said, and to hear that name on her lips was the sweetest thing I had ever known. "Dick, is it really you? Tell me I'm not dreaming." "It's me, sure enough, Mary dear, and now I have found you I will never let you go again. But my precious child, how on earth did you get here?" She disengaged herself and let her little electric torch wander over my rough habiliments. "You look a tremendous warrior, Dick. I have never seen you like this before. I was in Doubting Castle and very much afraid of giant despair till you came." "I think I call it the Interpreter's House," I said. "It's the house of somebody we both know," she went on. "He calls himself Bommaerts here. That was one of the 2 names, you remember. I have seen him since in Paris. Oh, it is a long story, and you shall hear it all soon. I knew he came here sometimes, so I came here too. I have been nursing for the last fortnight at the Douvecourt Hospital, only 4 miles away." "But what brought you alone at night?" "Madness, I think. Vanity, too. You see, I had found out a good deal, and I wanted to find out the one vital thing which had puzzled Mr. Blenkiron. I told myself it was foolish, but I couldn't keep away. And then my courage broke down, and before you came I would have screamed at the sound of a mouse. If I hadn't whistled I would have cried." "But why alone and at this hour?" "I couldn't get off in the day, and it was safest to come alone. You see, he is in love with me, and when he heard I was coming to Douvecourt, forgot his caution and proposed to meet me here. He said he was going on a long journey and wanted to say good-bye. If he had found me alone, well, he would have said good-bye. If there had been anyone with me, he would have suspected, and he mustn't suspect me. Mr. Blenkiron says that would be fatal to his great plan. He believes I am like my aunts, and that I think him an apostle of peace, working by his own methods against the stupidity and wickedness of all the governments. He talks more bitterly about Germany than about England. He told me how he had to disguise himself and play many parts on his mission, and of course I have applauded him. Oh, I have had a difficult autumn." "Mary," I cried, "tell me you hate him." "No," she said quietly, "I do not hate him. I am keeping that for later. I fear him desperately. Some day, when we have broken him utterly, I will hate him, and drive all likeness of him out of my memory like an unclean thing. But till then I won't waste energy on hate. We want to hoard every atom of our strength for the work of beating him." She had won back her composure, and I turned on my light to look at her. She was in nurse's outdoor uniform, and I thought her eyes seemed tired. The priceless gift that had suddenly come to me had driven out all recollection of my own errand. I thought of Ivery only as a would-be lover of Mary, and forgot the manufacturer from Lille who had rented the house for the partridge shooting. "And you, Dick," she asked, "is it part of a general's duty to pay visits at night to empty houses?" "I came to look for traces of Monsieur Bommaerts. I, too, got on his track from another angle, but that story must wait." "You observe that he has been here to-day?" She pointed to some cigarette ash spilled on the table edge, and a space on its surface cleared from dust. "In a place like this the dust would settle again in a few hours, and that is quite clean. I should say he has been here just after luncheon." "Great Scott!" I cried. "What a close shave! I'm in the mood at this moment to shoot him at sight. You say you saw him in Paris and knew his lair. Surely you had a good enough case to have him collared." She shook her head. "Mr. Blenkiron, he's in Paris too. Wouldn't hear of it. He hasn't just figured the thing out yet, he says. We've identified one of your names, but we're still in doubt about Chelius." "Ah, Chelius, yes, I see. We must get the whole business complete before we strike. Has old Blenkiron had any luck?" "Your guess about the deep breathing advertisement was very clever, Dick. It was true, and it may give us Chelius. I must leave Mr. Blenkiron to tell you how. But the trouble is this. We know something of the doings of someone who may be Chelius, but we can't link them with Ivery. We know that Ivery is Bommaerts, and our hope is to link Bommaerts with Chelius. That's why I came here. I was trying to burgle this escritoire in an amateur way. It's a bad piece of fake empire and deserves smashing." I could see that Mary was eager to get my mind back to business, and with some difficulty I clambered down from the exultant heights. The intoxication of the thing was on me, the winter night, the circle of light in that dreary room, the sudden coming together of two souls from the ends of the earth, the realization of my wildest hopes, the gilding and glorifying of all the future. But she had always twice as much wisdom as me, and we were in the midst of a campaign which had no use for daydreaming. I turned my attention to the desk. It was a flat table with drawers, and at the back a half circle of more drawers with a central cupboard. I tilted it up, and most of the drawers slid out, empty of anything but dust. I forced two open with my knife, and they held empty cigar boxes. Only the cupboard remained, and that appeared to be locked. I wedged a key from my pocket into its keyhole, but the thing would not budge. "It's no good," I said. "He wouldn't leave anything he valued in a place like this. That sort of fellow doesn't take risks. If he wanted to hide something, there are 100 holes in this chateau which would puzzle the best detective." "Can't you open it?" she asked. "I've a fancy about that table. He was sitting here this afternoon, and he may be coming back." I solved the problem by turning up the escritoire and putting my knee through the cupboard door. Out of it tumbled a little dark green attaché case. "This is getting solemn," said Mary. "Is it locked?" It was, but I took my knife and cut the lock out and spilled the contents on the table. There were some papers, a newspaper or two, and a small bag tied with black cord. The last I opened while Mary looked over my shoulder. It contained a fine yellowish powder. "Stand back," I said harshly. "For God's sake, stand back and don't breathe." With trembling hands I tied the bag up again, rolled it in a newspaper and stuffed it into my pocket. For I remembered a day near Peronne when a Boche plane had come over in the night and had dropped little bags like this. Happily they were all collected, and the men who found them were wise and took them off to the nearest laboratory. They proved to be full of anthrax germs. I remembered how Eaucourt Sainte-Anne stood at the junction of a dozen roads where all day long troops passed to and from the lines. From such a vantage point an enemy could wreck the health of an army. I remembered the woman I had seen in the courtyard of this house in the foggy dusk, and I knew now why she had worn a gas mask. The discovery gave me a horrid shock. I was brought down with a crash from my high sentiment to something earthly and devilish. I was fairly well used to Boche filthiness, but this seemed too grim a piece of the utterly damnable. I wanted to have Ivory by the throat and force the stuff into his body and watch him decay slowly into the horror he had contrived for honest men. "Let's get out of this infernal place," I said. But Mary was not listening. She had picked up one of the newspapers and was gloating over it. I looked and saw that it was open at an advertisement of Weissmann's deep-breathing system. "Oh, look, Dick!" she cried breathlessly. The column of type had little dots made by a red pencil below certain words. "It's it," she whispered. "It's the cipher. I'm almost sure it's the cipher." "Well, he'd be likely to know it if anyone did." "But don't you see it's the cipher which Chelius uses, the man in Switzerland? Oh, I can't explain now, for it's very long, but I think I have found out what we have all been wanting. Chelius—" "Whoosht!" I said. "What's that?" There was a queer sound from the out of doors, as if a sudden wind had risen in the still night. "It's only a car on the main road," said Mary. "How did you get in?" I asked. "By the broken window in the next room. I cycled out here one morning, and I walked round the place and found the broken catch." "Perhaps it is left open on purpose. That may be the way Monsieur Bommaerts visits his country home. Let's get off, Mary, for this place has a curse on it. It deserves fire from heaven." I slipped the contents of the attaché case into my pockets. "I'm going to drive you back," I said. "I've got a car out there." "Then you must take my bicycle and my servant too. He's an old friend of yours, one Andrew Amos." "Now how on earth did Andrew get over here?" "He's one of us," said Mary, laughing at my surprise. "A most useful member of our party, at present disguised as an infirmier in Lady Manorwater's hospital at Douvecourt. He is learning French and—" "Hush," I whispered. "There's someone in the next room." I swept her behind a stack of furniture, with my eyes glued on a crack of light below the door. The handle turned and the shadows raced before a big electric lamp of the kind they have in stables. I could not see the bearer, but I guessed it was the old woman. There was a man behind her. A brisk step sounded on the parquet, and a figure brushed past her. It wore the horizon blue of a French officer, very smart, with those French riding boots that showed the shape of the leg, and a handsome fur-lined pelisse. I would have called him a young man, not more than 35. The face was brown and clean-shaven, the eyes bright and masterful. Yet he did not deceive me. I had not boasted idly to Sir Walter when I said that there was one man alive who could never again be mistaken by me. I had my hand on my pistol as I motioned Mary farther back into the shadows. For a second I was about to shoot. I had a perfect mark and could have put a bullet through his brain with utter certitude. I think if I had been alone I might have fired. Perhaps not. Anyhow, now I could not do it. It seemed like potting at a sitting rabbit. I was obliged, though he was my worst enemy, to give him a chance, while all the while my sober senses kept calling me a fool. I stepped into the light. "Hello, Mr. Ivery," I said. "This is an odd place to meet again." In his amazement he fell back a step, while his hungry eyes took in my face. There was no mistake about the recognition. I saw something I had seen once before in him, and that was fear. Out went the light, and he sprang for the door. I fired in the dark, but the shot must have been too high. In the same instant I heard him slip on the smooth parquet, and the tinkle of glass as the broken window swung open. Hastily I reflected that his car must be at the moat end of the terrace, and that therefore to reach it he must pass outside this very room. Seizing the damaged escritoire, I used it as a ram and charged the window nearest me. The panes and shutters went with a crash, for I had driven the thing out of its rotten frame. The next moment I was on the moonlit snow. I got a shot at him as he went over the terrace, and again I went wide. I have never been at my best with a pistol. Still, I reckoned I had got him, for the car which was waiting below must come back by the moat to reach the high road. But I had forgotten the great closed park gates. Somehow or other they must have been opened, for as soon as the car started it headed straight for the Grand Avenue. I tried a couple of long-range shots after it, and one must have damaged either Ivory or his chauffeur, for there came back a cry of pain. I turned in deep chagrin to find Mary beside me. She was bubbling with laughter. "Were you ever a cinema actor, Dick? The last 2 minutes have been a really high-class performance, featuring Mary Lamington. How does the jargon go?" "I could have got him when he first entered," I said ruefully. "I know," she said in a graver tone, "only, of course, you couldn't. Besides, Mr. Blenkiron doesn't want it, yet." She put her hand on my arm. "Don't worry about it. It wasn't written it should happen that way. It would have been too easy. We have a long road to travel yet before we clip the wings of the wild birds." "Look," I cried, "the fire from heaven!" Red tongues of flame were shooting up from the outbuildings at the farther end, the place where I had first seen the woman. Some agreed plan must have been acted on, and Ivory was destroying all traces of his infamous yellow powder. Even now the concierge with her odds and ends of belongings would be slipping out to some refuge in the village. In the still dry night the flames rose, for the place must have been made ready for a rapid burning. As I hurried Mary round the moat, I could see that part of the main building had caught fire. The hamlet was awakened, and before we reached the corner of the high road, sleepy British soldiers were hurrying towards the scene, and the town major was mustering the fire brigade. I knew that Ivory had laid his plans well, and that they hadn't a chance, that long before dawn the chateau of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne would be a heap of ashes, and that in a day or two the lawyers of the aged Marquise at Biarritz would be wrangling with the insurance company. At the corner stood Amos beside 2 bicycles, solid as a graven image. He recognized me with a gap-toothed grin. "It's a cold night, General, but the home fires keep burning. I haven't seen such a cheery low since Dixon's Mill at Gawley." We packed, bicycles and all, into my car, with Amos wedged in the narrow seat beside Hamilton. Recognising a fellow countryman, he gave thanks for the lift in the broadest Doric. "For," said he, "I'm not what you would call a practised hand with a velocipede, and my feet are dinled with standing in the snaw." As for me, the miles to Douvecourt passed in a blissful moment of time. I wrapped Mary in a fur rug, and after that we did not speak a word. I had come suddenly into a great possession and was dazed with the joy of it. Chapter 14. Mr. Blenkiron discourses on love and war. 3 days later I got my orders to report at Paris for special service. They came none too soon, for I chafed at each hour's delay. Every thought in my head was directed to the game which we were playing against Ivory. He was the big enemy, compared to whom the ordinary Boche in the trenches was innocent and friendly. I had almost lost interest in my division, for I knew that for me the real battlefront was not in Picardy, and that my job was not so easy as holding a length of line. Also, I longed to be at the same work as Mary. I remember waking up in billets the morning after the night at the chateau with the feeling that I had become extraordinarily rich. I felt very humble, too, and very kindly towards all the world, even to the Boche, though I can't say I had ever hated him very wildly. You find hate more among journalists and politicians at home than among fighting men. I wanted to be quiet and alone to think, and since that was impossible, I went about my work in a happy abstraction. I tried not to look ahead, but only to live in the present, remembering that a war was on, and that there was desperate and dangerous work before me, and that my hopes hung on a slender thread. Yet for all that I had sometimes to let my fancies go free and revel in delicious dreams. But there was one thought that always brought me back to hard ground, and that was Ivory. I do not think I hated anybody in the world but him. It was his relation to Mary that stung me. He had the insolence, with all his toad-like past, to make love to that clean and radiant girl. I felt that he and I stood as mortal antagonists, and the thought pleased me, for it helped me to put some honest detestation into my job. Also, I was going to win. Twice I had failed, but the third time I should succeed. It had been like ranging shots for a gun. First short, second over, and I vowed that the third should be dead on the mark. I was summoned to GHQ, where I had half an hour's talk with the greatest British commander. I can see yet his patient, kindly face, and that steady eye which no vicissitude of fortune could perturb. He took the biggest view, for he was statesman as well as soldier, and I knew that the whole world was one battlefield, and every man and woman among the combatant nations was in the battle line. So contradictory is human nature, that talk made me wish for a moment to stay where I was. I wanted to go on serving under that man. I realized suddenly how much I loved my work, and when I got back to my quarters that night and saw my men swinging in from a route march, I could have howled like a dog at leaving them. Though I say it who shouldn't, there wasn't a better division in the army. One morning, a few days later, I picked up Mary in Amiens. I always liked the place, for after the dirt of the Somme, it was a comfort to go there for a bath and a square meal, and it had the noblest church that the hand of man ever built for God. It was a clear morning when we started from the boulevard beside the railway station, and the air smelt of washed streets and fresh coffee, and women were going marketing, and the little trams ran clanking by, just as in any other city far from the sound of guns. There was very little khaki or horizon blue about, and I remember thinking how completely Amiens had got out of the war zone. 2 months later, it was a different story. To the end, I shall count that day as one of the happiest in my life. Spring was in the air, though the trees and fields had still their winter colouring. 1,000 good fresh scents came out of the earth, and the larks were busy over the new furrows. I remember that we ran up a little glen, where a stream spread into pools among sallows, and the roadside trees were heavy with mistletoe. On the tableland beyond the Somme valley the sun shone like April. At Beauvais we lunched badly in an inn, badly as to food, but there was an excellent Burgundy at 2 francs a bottle. Then we slipped down through little flat-chested townships to the Seine, and in the late afternoon passed through the Saint-Germain forest. The wide green spaces among the trees set my fancy dwelling on that divine English countryside where Mary and I would one day make our home. She had been in high spirits all the journey, but when I spoke of the Cotswolds her face grew grave. "Don't let us speak of it, Dick," she said. "It's too happy a thing, and I feel as if it would wither if we touched it. I don't let myself think of peace and home, for it makes me too homesick. I think we shall get there some day, you and I, but it's a long road to the Delectable Mountains, and Faithful, you know, has to die first. There is a price to be paid." The words sobered me. "Who was our Faithful?" I asked. "I don't know, but he was the best of the pilgrims." Then, as if a veil had lifted, her mood changed, and when we came through the suburbs of Paris and swung down the Champs-Élysées, she was in a holiday humour. The lights were twinkling in the blue January dusk, and the warm breath of the city came to greet us. I knew little of the place, for I had visited only once on a 4 days' Paris leave, but it had seemed to me then the most habitable of cities, and now, coming from the battlefield with Mary by my side, it was like the happy ending of a dream. I left her at her cousin's house near the Rue Saint-Honoré, and deposited myself, according to instructions, at the Hôtel Louis XV. There I wallowed in a hot bath and got into the civilian clothes which had been sent on from London. They made me feel that I had taken leave of my division for good and all this time. Blenkiron had a private room where we were to dine, and a more wonderful litter of books and cigar boxes I have never seen, for he hadn't a notion of tidiness. I could hear him grunting at his toilet in the adjacent bedroom, and I noticed that the table was laid for 3. I went downstairs to get a paper, and on the way ran into Lancelot Wake. He was no longer a private in a Labour battalion. Evening clothes showed beneath his overcoat. "Hello, Wake, are you in this push too?" "I suppose so," he said, and his manner was not cordial. "Anyhow, I was ordered down here. My business is to do as I'm told." "Coming to dine?" I asked. "No, I'm dining with some friends at the Crillon." Then he looked me in the face, and his eyes were hot as I first remembered them. "I hear I've to congratulate you, Hannay," and he held out a limp hand. I never felt more antagonism in a human being. "You don't like it," I said, for I guessed what he meant. "How on earth can I like it?" he cried angrily. "Good Lord, man, you'll murder her soul. You, an ordinary, stupid, successful fellow, and she's the most precious thing God ever made. You can never understand a fraction of her preciousness, but you'll clip her wings all right. She can never fly now." He poured out this hysterical stuff to me at the foot of the staircase, within hearing of an elderly French widow with a poodle. I had no impulse to be angry, for I was far too happy. "Don't, Wake," I said. "We're all too close together to quarrel. I'm not fit to Black Mary's shoes. You can't put me too low or her too high, but I've at least the sense to know it. You couldn't want me to be humbler than I felt." He shrugged his shoulders as he went out into the street. "Your infernal magnanimity would break any man's temper." I went upstairs to find Blenkiron, washed and shaven, admiring a pair of bright patent leather shoes. "Why, Dick, I've been wearying bad to see you. I was nervous you would be blown to glory, for I've been reading awful things about your battles in the newspapers. The war correspondents worry me so I can't take breakfast." He mixed cocktails and clinked his glass on mine. "Here's to the young lady. I was trying to write her a pretty little sonnet, but the darned rhymes wouldn't fit. I've gotten a heap of things to say to you when we've finished dinner." Mary came in, her cheeks bright from the weather, and Blenkiron promptly fell abashed. But she had a way to meet his shyness, for, when he began an embarrassed speech of good wishes, she put her arms round his neck and kissed him. Oddly enough, that set him completely at his ease. It was pleasant to eat off linen and china again, pleasant to see old Blenkiron's benignant face and the way he tucked into his food, but it was delicious for me to sit at a meal with Mary across the table. It made me feel that she was really mine, and not a pixie that would vanish at a word. To Blenkiron she bore herself like an affectionate but mischievous daughter, while the desperately refined manners that afflicted him whenever women were concerned mellowed into something like his everyday self. They did most of the talking, and I remember he fetched from some mysterious hiding place a great box of chocolates, which you could no longer buy in Paris, and the two ate them like spoiled children. I didn't want to talk, for it was pure happiness for me to look on. I loved to watch her, when the servants had gone, with her elbows on the table like a schoolboy, her crisp gold hair a little rumpled, cracking walnuts with gusto, like some child who has been allowed down from the nursery for dessert and means to make the most of it. With his first cigar, Blenkiron got to business. "You want to know about the staff work we've been busy on at home? Well, it's finished now, thanks to you, Dick. We weren't getting on very fast till you took to perusing the press on your sick bed and dropped us that hint about the deep breathing ads." "Then there was something in it?" I asked. "There was black hell in it. There wasn't any Gussiter, but there was a mighty fine little syndicate of crooks with old man Gresson at the back of them. First thing, I started out to get the cipher. It took some looking for, but there's no cipher on earth can't be got hold of somehow if you know it's there, and in this case we were helped a lot by the return messages in the German papers. It was bad stuff when we read it, and explained the dark leakages and important news we've been up against. At first I figured to keep the thing going and turn Gussiter into a corporation with John S. Blenkiron as president. But it wouldn't do, for at the first hint of tampering with their communications, the whole bunch got skeery and sent out SOS signals. So we tenderly plucked the flowers. "Gresson too?" I asked. He nodded. "I guess your seafaring companion's now under the sod. We had collected enough evidence to hang him 10 times over. But that was the least of it. For your little old cipher, Dick gave us a line on ivory." I asked how, and Blenkiron told me the story. He had about a dozen cross bearings proving that the organization of the deep breathing game had its headquarters in Switzerland. He suspected ivory from the first, but the man had vanished out of his ken, so he started working from the other end, and instead of trying to deduce the Swiss business from ivory, he tried to deduce ivory from the Swiss business. He went to Bern and made a conspicuous public fool of himself for several weeks. He called himself an agent of the American propaganda there, and took some advertising space in the press, and put in spread-eagle announcements of his mission, with the result that the Swiss government threatened to turn him out of the country if he tampered that amount with their neutrality. He also wrote a lot of rot in the Geneva newspapers, which he paid to have printed, explaining how he was a pacifist and was going to convert Germany to peace by inspirational advertisement of pure-minded war aims. All this was in keeping with his English reputation, and he wanted to make himself a bait for ivory. But ivory did not rise to the fly, and though he had a dozen agents working for him on the quiet, he could never hear of the name Chelios. That was, he reckoned, a very private and particular name among the wild birds. However, he got to know a good deal about the Swiss end of the deep breathing business. That took some doing and cost a lot of money. His best people were a girl who posed as a mannequin in a milliner's shop in Lyon and a concierge in a big hotel at St. Moritz. His most important discovery was that there was a second cipher in the return messages sent from Switzerland, different from the one that the Gussiter lot used in England. He got this cipher, but though he could read it, he couldn't make anything out of it. He concluded that it was a very secret means of communication between the inner circle of the wild birds, and that ivory must be at the back of it. But he was still a long way from finding out anything that mattered. Then the whole situation changed, for Mary got in touch with Ivory. I must say she behaved like a shameless minx, for she kept on writing to him to an address he had once given her in Paris, and suddenly she got an answer. She was in Paris herself, helping to run one of the railway canteens, and staying with her French cousins, the de Mézières. One day he came to see her. That showed the boldness of the man and his cleverness, for the whole secret police of France were after him, and they never got within sight or sound. Yet here he was, coming openly in the afternoon to have tea with an English girl. It showed another thing which made me blaspheme. A man so resolute and single-hearted in his job must have been pretty badly in love to take a risk like that. He came, and he called himself the Capitaine Bommaerts, with a transport job on the staff of the French GQG. He was on the staff right enough, too. Mary said that when she heard that name she nearly fell down. He was quite frank with her, and she with him. They are both peacemakers, ready to break the laws of any land for the sake of a great ideal. Goodness knows what stuff they talk together. Mary said she would blush to think of it till her dying day, and I gathered that on her side it was a mixture of Lancelot Wake at his most pedantic and schoolgirl silliness. He came again, and they met often, unbeknown to the decorous Madame de Mézières. They walked together in the Bois de Boulogne, and once with a beating heart she motored with him to Auteuil for luncheon. He spoke of his house in Picardy, and there were moments, I gathered, when he became the declared lover to be rebuffed with a hoydenish shyness. Presently the pace became too hot, and after some anguished arguments with Bullivant on the long-distance telephone, she went off to Douvecourt to Lady Manorwater's hospital. She went there to escape from him, but mainly, I think, to have a look, trembling in every limb, mind you, at the Chateau of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne. I had only to think of Mary to know just what Joan of Arc was. No man ever born could have done that kind of thing. It wasn't recklessness, it was sheer, calculating courage. Then Blenkiron took up the tale. The newspaper we found that Christmas Eve in the chateau was of tremendous importance, for Bommaerts had pricked out in the advertisement the very special second cipher of the wild birds. That proved that Ivory was at the back of the Swiss business, but Blenkiron made doubly sure. "I considered the time had come," he said, "to pay high for valuable news, so I sold the enemy a very pretty device. If you ever gave your mind to ciphers and illicit correspondence, Dick, you would know that the one kind of document you can't write on in invisible ink is a coated paper, the kind they use in the weeklies to print photographs of leading actresses and the stately homes of England. Anything wet that touches it corrugates the surface a little, and you can tell with a microscope if someone's been playing at it. Well, we had the good fortune to discover just how to get over that little difficulty, how to write on glazed paper with a quill so as the cutest analyst couldn't spot it, and likewise how to detect the writing. I decided to sacrifice that invention, casting my bread upon the waters and looking for a good-sized bakery in return. I had it sold to the enemy. The job wanted delicate handling, but the 10th man from me, he was an Austrian Jew, did the deal and scooped $50,000 out of it. Then I lay low to watch how my friend would use the device, and I didn't wait long. He took from his pocket a folded sheet of l'illustration. Over a photogravure plate ran some words in a large sprawling hand, as if written with a brush. "That page, when I got it yesterday," he said, "was an unassuming picture of General Pétain presenting military medals. There wasn't a scratch or a ripple on its surface. But I got busy with it, and see there." He pointed out 2 names. The writing was a set of key words we did not know, but 2 names stood out which I knew too well. They were Bommaerts and Chelius. "My God," I cried, "that's uncanny. It only shows that if you chew long enough—" "Dick," said Mary, "you mustn't say that again. At the best it's an ugly metaphor, and you're making it a platitude." "Who is Ivory, anyhow?" I asked. "Do you know more about him than we knew in the summer? Mary, what did Bommaerts pretend to be?" "An Englishman." Mary spoke in the most matter-of-fact tone, as if it were a perfectly usual thing to be made love to by a spy, and that rather soothed my annoyance. "When he asked me to marry him, he proposed to take me to a country house in Devonshire. I rather think, too, he had a place in Scotland. But, of course, he's a German." "Yes," said Blenkiron slowly. "I've got onto his record, and it isn't a pretty story. It's taken some working out, but I've got all the links tested now. He's a Boche and a large-sized nobleman in his own state. Did you ever hear of the Graf von Schwabing?" I shook my head. "I think I have heard Uncle Charlie speak of him," said Mary, wrinkling her brows. "He used to hunt with the Pytchley." "That's the man, but he hasn't troubled the Pytchley for the last 8 years. There was a time when he was the last thing in smartness in the German court. Officer in the Guards, ancient family, rich, darned clever, all the fixings. Kaiser liked him, and it's easy to see why. I guess a man who had as many personalities as the Graf was amusing after dinner company. Especially among Germans, who in my experience don't excel in the lighter vein. Anyway, he was William's white-headed boy, and there wasn't a mother with a daughter who wasn't out gunning for Otto von Schwabing. He was about as popular in London and New York, and in Paris too. Ask Sir Walter about him, Dick. He says he had twice the brains of Kuhlmann and better manners than that Austrian fellow he used to yarn about. Well, one day there came an almighty court scandal, and the bottom dropped out of the Graf's world. It was a pretty beastly story, and I don't gather that Schwabing was as deep in it as some others. But the trouble was that those others had to be shielded at all costs, and Schwabing was made the scapegoat. His name came out in the papers, and he had to go." "What was the case called?" I asked. Blenkiron mentioned a name, and I knew why the word Schwabing was familiar. I had read the story long ago in Rhodesia. "It was some smash," Blenkiron went on. He was drummed out of the Guards, out of the clubs, out of the country. Now, how would you have felt, Dick, if you had been the Graf? Your life and work and happiness crossed out, and all to save a mangy princeling. Bitter as hell, you say, hungering for a chance to put it across the lot that had outed you? You wouldn't rest till you had William sobbing on his knees, asking your pardon, and you not thinking of granting it? That's the way you'd feel, but that wasn't the Graf's way, and what's more, it isn't the German way. He went into exile hating humanity, and with a heart all poison and snakes, but itching to get back. And I'll tell you why. It's because his kind of German hasn't got any other home on this earth. Oh yes, I know there's stacks of good old Teutons come and squat in our little country and turn into fine Americans. You can do a lot with them if you catch them young and teach them the Declaration of Independence and make them study our Sunday papers. But you can't deny there's something comic in the rough about all Germans before you've civilized them. They're a peculiar people, a darn peculiar people, else they wouldn't staff all the menial and indecent occupations in the globe. But that peculiarity, which is only skin deep in the working Boche, is in the bone of the grandee. Your German aristocracy can't consort on terms of equality with any other upper 10,000. They swagger and bluff about the world, but they know very well that the world's sniggering at them. They're like a boss from Salt Creek Gully who's made his pile and bought a dress suit and dropped into a Newport evening party. They don't know where to put their hands or how to keep their feet still. Your copper-bottomed English nobleman has got to keep jogging himself to treat them as equals instead of sending them down to the servants' hall. Their fine fixings are just the high light that reveals the everlasting J. They can't be gentlemen because they aren't sure of themselves. The world laughs at them and they know it, and it riles them like hell. That's why when a Graf is booted out of the fatherland, he's got to creep back somehow or be a wandering Jew for the rest of time. Blenkiron lit another cigar and fixed me with his steady, ruminating eye. For 8 years the man has slaved, body and soul, for the men who degraded him. He's earned his restoration, and I dare say he's got it in his pocket. If merit was rewarded, he should be covered with iron crosses and red eagles. He had a pretty good hand to start out with. He knew other countries, and he was a dandy at languages. More, he had an uncommon gift for living apart. That is real genius, Dick, however much it gets up against us. Best of all, he had a first-class outfit of brains. I can't say I ever struck a better, and I've come across some bright citizens in my time. And now he's going to win out unless we get mighty busy. There was a knock at the door, and the solid figure of Andrew Amos revealed itself. "It's time you was home, Miss Mary. It chapped at 11:30 as I came up the stairs. It's coming on to rain, so I've brought an umbrelly." "One word," I said. "How old is the man?" "Just gone 36, Blenkiron replied. I turned to Mary, who nodded. "Younger than you, Dick," she said wickedly as she got into her big Jaeger coat. "I'm going to see you home," I said. "Not allowed. You've had quite enough of my society for one day. Andrew's on escort duty tonight." Blenkiron looked after her as the door closed. "I reckon you've got the best girl in the world." "Ivory thinks the same," I said grimly, for my detestation of the man who had made love to Mary fairly choked me. "You can see why. Here's this degenerate coming out of his rotten class, all pampered and petted and satiated with the easy pleasures of life. He has seen nothing of women except the bad kind and the overfed specimens of his own country. I hate being impolite about females, but I've always considered the German variety uncommon like cows. He has had desperate years of intrigue and danger, and consorting with every kind of scalawag. Remember, he's a big man and a poet, with a brain and an imagination that takes every grade without changing gears. Suddenly he meets something that is as fresh and lovely as a spring flower, and has wits too, and the steeliest courage, and yet is all youth and gaiety. It's a new experience for him, a kind of revelation, and he's big enough to value her as she should be valued. No, Dick, I can understand you getting cross, but I reckon it an item to the man's credit." "It's his blind spot all the same," I said. "His blind spot," Blenkiron repeated solemnly. And please God, we're going to remember that. Next morning, in miserable, sloppy weather, Blenkiron carted me about Paris. We climbed 5 sets of stairs to a flat away up in Montmartre, where I was talked to by a fat man with spectacles and a slow voice and told various things that deeply concerned me. Then I went to a room in the Boulevard Saint-Germain with a little cabinet opening off it, where I was shown papers and maps and some figures on a sheet of paper that made me open my eyes. We lunched in a modest café tucked away behind the Palais Royal, and our companions were 2 Alsatians who spoke German better than a Boche and had no names, only numbers. In the afternoon I went to a low building beside the Invalides and saw many generals, including more than one whose features were familiar in 2 hemispheres. I told them everything about myself, and I was examined like a convict, and all particulars about my appearance and manner of speech written down in a book. That was to prepare the way for me, in case of need, among the vast army of those who work underground and know their chief but do not know each other. The rain cleared before night, and Blenkiron and I walked back to the hotel through that lemon-coloured dusk that you get in a French winter. We passed a company of American soldiers, and Blenkiron had to stop and stare. I could see that he was stiff with pride, though he wouldn't show it. "What do you think of that bunch?" he asked. "First-rate stuff," I said. "The men are all right," he drawled critically, "but some of the officer boys are a bit puffy. They want fining down." "They'll get it soon enough, honest fellows. You can't keep your weight long in this war." "Say, Dick," he said shyly, "what do you truly think of our Americans? You've seen a lot of them, and I'd value your views." His tone was that of a bashful author asking for an opinion on his first book. "I'll tell you what I think. You're constructing a great middle-class army, and that's the most formidable fighting machine on earth. This kind of war doesn't want the berserker so much as the quiet fellow with a trained mind and a lot to fight for. The American ranks are filled with all sorts, from cowpunchers to college boys, but mostly with decent lads that have good prospects in life before them and are fighting because they feel they're bound to, not because they like it. It was the same stock that pulled through your Civil War. We have a middle-class division too, Scottish territorials, mostly clerks and shopmen and engineers and farmers' sons. When I first struck them, my only crab was that the officers weren't much better than the men. It's still true, but the men are super excellent, and consequently so are the officers. That division gets top marks in the Boche calendar for sheer fighting devilment. And please God, that's what your American army's going to be. You can wash out the old idea of a regiment of scalawags commanded by dukes. That was right enough, maybe, in the days when you hurrooshed into battle waving a banner, but it don't do with high explosives and a couple of million men on each side and a battlefront of 500 miles. The hero of this war is the plain man out of the middle class who wants to get back to his home and is going to use all the brains and grit he possesses to finish the job soon." "That sounds about right," said Blenkiron reflectively. "It pleases me some, for you've maybe guessed that I respect the British Army quite a little. Which part of it do you put top?" "All of it's good. The French are keen judges, and they give front place to the Scots and the Australians. For myself, I think the backbone of the army is the old-fashioned English county regiments that hardly ever get into the papers. Though I don't know, if I had to pick, but I'd take the South Africans. There's only a brigade of them, but they're hell's delight in a battle. But then you'll say I'm prejudiced." "Well," drawled Blenkiron, "you're a mighty empire anyhow. I've sojourned up and down it, and I can't guess how the old-time highbrows in your little island came to put it together. But I'll let you into a secret, Dick. I read this morning in a newspaper that there was a natural affinity between Americans and the men of the British Dominions. Take it from me, there isn't, at least not with this American. I don't understand them one little bit. When I see your lean, tall Australians with the sun at the back of their eyes, I'm looking at men from another planet. Outside you and Peter, I never got to fathom a South African. The Canadians live over the fence from us, but you mix up a Canuck with a Yank in your remarks and you'll get a bat in the eye. But most of us Americans have gotten a grip on your old country. You'll find us mighty respectful to other parts of your empire, but we say anything we damn well please about England. You see, we know her that well and like her that well, we can be free with her. It's like," he concluded as we reached the hotel, "it's like a lot of boys that are getting on in the world and are a bit jealous and stand-offish with each other. But they're all at home with the old man who used to warm them up with a hickory cane, even though sometimes in their haste they called him a stand-patter." That night at dinner we talked solid business, Blenkiron and I, and the young French colonel from the 3e section at GQG. Blenkiron, I remember, got very hurt about being called a businessman by the Frenchman, who thought he was paying him a compliment. "Cut it out," he said. "It's a word that's gone bad with me. There's just two kinds of men, those who've gotten sense and those who haven't. A big percentage of us Americans make our living by trading, but we don't think because a man's in business, or even because he's made big money, that he's any natural good at every job. We've made a college professor our president, and do what he tells us like little boys, though he don't earn more than some of us pay our works manager. You English have gotten business on the brain, and think a fellow's a dandy at handling your government if he happens to have made a pile by some flat-catching ramp on your stock exchange. It makes me tired. You're about the best business nation on earth, but for God's sake don't begin to talk about it, or you'll lose your power. And don't go confusing real business with the ordinary gift of raking in the dollars. Any man with sense could make money if he wanted to, but he mayn't want. He may prefer the fun of the job and let other people do the looting. I reckon the biggest business on the globe today is the work behind your lines and the way you feed and supply and transport your army. It beats the Steel Corporation and the Standard Oil to a frazzle. But the man at the head of it all don't earn more than $1,000 a month. Your nation's getting to worship Mammon, Dick. Cut it out. There's just the one difference in humanity, sense or no sense, and most likely you won't find any more sense in the man that makes $1 billion selling bonds than in his brother Tim that lives in a shack and sells corn cobs. I'm not speaking out of sinful jealousy, for there was a day when I was reckoned a railroad king, and I quit with a bigger pile than kings usually retire on. But I haven't the sense of old Peter, who never even had a bank account, and it's sense that wins in this war. The colonel, who spoke good English, asked a question about a speech which some politician had made. "There isn't all the sense I'd like to see at the top," said Blenkiron. "They're fine, smooth words. That wouldn't matter, but they're thinking smooth thoughts. What do you make of the situation, Dick?" "I think it's the worst since first Ypres," said. "Everybody's cock-a-hoop, but God knows why." "God knows why," Blenkiron repeated. "I reckon it's a simple calculation, and you can't deny it any more than a mathematical law. Russia is counted out. The Boche won't get food from her for a good many months, but he can get more men, and he's got them. He's fighting only on one foot, and he's been able to bring troops and guns west, so he's as strong as the Allies now on paper, and he's stronger in reality. He's got better railways behind him, and he's fighting on inside lines and can concentrate fast against any bit of our front. I'm no soldier, but that's so, Dick?" The Frenchman smiled and shook his head. "All the same, they will not pass. They could not when they were 2-1 in 1914, and they will not now. If we Allies could not break through in the last year when we had many more men, how will the Germans succeed now with only equal numbers?" Blenkiron did not look convinced. "That's what they all say. I talked to a general last week about the coming offensive, and he said he was praying for it to hurry up, for he reckoned Fritz would get the fright of his life. It's a good spirit, maybe, but I don't think it's sound on the facts. We've got two mighty great armies of fine fighting men, but because we've two commands, we're bound to move ragged like a peal of bells. The Hun's got one army and 40 years of stiff tradition, and what's more, he's going all out this time. He's going to smash our front before America lines up or perish in the attempt. Why do you suppose all the peace racket in Germany has died down, and the very men that were talking democracy in the summer are now hot for fighting to a finish? I'll tell you. It's because old Ludendorff has promised them complete victory this spring if they spend enough men, and the Boche is a good gambler and is out to risk it. We're not up against a local attack this time. We're standing up to a great nation going bald-headed for victory or destruction. If we're broken, then America's got to fight a new campaign by herself when she's ready, and the Boche has time to make Russia his feeding ground and diddle our blockade. That puts another 5 years onto the war, maybe another 10. Are we free and independent people going to endure that much? I tell you, we're tossing to quit before Easter." He turned towards me and I nodded assent. "That's more or less my view," I said. "We ought to hold, but it'll be by our teeth and nails. For the next 6 months we'll be fighting without any margin." "But, my friends, you put it too gravely," cried the Frenchman. "We may lose a mile or two of ground, yes, but serious danger is not possible. They had better chances at Verdun, and they failed. Why should they succeed now?" "Because they are staking everything," Blenkiron replied. "It's the last desperate struggle of a wounded beast, and in these struggles sometimes the hunter perishes. Dick's right. We've got a wasting margin, and every extra ounce of weight's going to tell. The battle's in the field, and it's also in every corner of every Allied land. That's why within the next 2 months we've got to get even with the wild birds." The French colonel, his name was de Vallière, smiled at the name, and Blenkiron answered my unspoken question. "I'm going to satisfy some of your curiosity, Dick, for I've put together considerable news of the menagerie. Germany has a good army of spies outside her borders. We shoot a batch now and then, but the others go on working like beavers, and they do a mighty deal of harm. They're beautifully organized, but they don't draw on such good human material as we, and I reckon they don't pay in results more than 10 cents on a dollar of trouble. But there they are. They're the intelligence officers, and their business is just to forward news. They're the birds in the cage, what is it your friend called them?" "Die Stubenvögel," I said. "Yes, but all the birds aren't caged. There are few outside the bars, and they don't collect news. They do things. If there's anything desperate, they're put on the job, and they've got power to act without waiting on instructions from home. I've investigated till my brain's tired, and I haven't made out more than half a dozen whom I can say for certain are in the business. There's your pal, the Portuguese Jew, Dick. Another's a woman in Genoa, a princess of some sort married to a Greek financier. One's the editor of a pro-Ally up-country paper in the Argentine. One passes as a Baptist minister in Colorado. One was a police spy in the Tsar's government and is now a red-hot revolutionary in the Caucasus. And the biggest, of course, is Moxon Ivory, who in happier times was the Graf von Schwabing. There aren't above 100 people in the world know of their existence, and these 100 call them the wild birds." "Do they work together?" I asked. "Yes, they each get their own jobs to do, but they're apt to flock together for a big piece of devilment. There were 4 of them in France a year ago before the Battle of the Aisne, and they pretty near rotted the French army. That's so, Colonel?" The soldier nodded grimly. "They seduced our weary troops, and they bought many politicians. Almost they succeeded, but not quite. The nation is sane again, and is judging and shooting the accomplices at its leisure. But the principals we have never caught." "You hear that, Dick?" said Blenkiron. "You're satisfied this isn't a whimsy of a melodramatic old Yank? I'll tell you more. You know how Ivory worked the submarine business from England. Also, it was the wild birds that wrecked Russia. It was Ivory that paid the Bolshevists to seduce the army, and the Bolshevists took his money for their own purposes, thinking they were playing a deep game, when all the time he was grinning like Satan, for they were playing his. It was Ivory, or some other of the bunch, that doped the brigades that broke at Caporetto. If I started in to tell you the history of their doings, you wouldn't go to bed, and if you did, you wouldn't sleep. There's just this to it. Every finished subtle devilry that the Boche has wrought among the Allies since August 1914 has been the work of the wild birds and more or less organized by Ivory. They're worth half a dozen army corps to Ludendorff. They're the mightiest poison merchants the world ever saw, and they've the nerve of hell." "I don't know," I interrupted. "Ivory's got his soft spot. I saw him in the tube station." "Maybe, but he's got the kind of nerve that's wanted. And now I rather fancy he's whistling in his flock." Blenkiron consulted the notebook. "Pavia, that's the Argentine man. Started last month for Europe. He transshipped from a coasting steamer in the West Indies, and we've temporarily lost track of him, but he's left his hunting ground. What do you reckon that means?" "It means," Blenkiron continued solemnly, "that Ivery thinks the game's nearly over, the play's working up for the big climax, and that climax is going to be damnation for the Allies unless we get a move on." "Right," I said. "That's what I'm here for. What's the move?" "The wild birds mustn't ever go home when the man they call Ivery or Bommaerts or Caelius has to decease. It's a cold-blooded proposition, but it's him of the world that's got to break. But before he quits this earth we're bound to get wise about some of his plans, and that means that we can't just shoot a pistol at his face. Also, we've got to find him first. We reckon he's in Switzerland, but that is a state with quite a lot of diversified scenery to lose a man in. Still, I guess we'll find him. But it's the kind of business to plan out as carefully as a battle. I'm going back to Bern on my old stunt to boss the show, and I'm giving the orders. You're an obedient child, Dick, so I don't reckon on any trouble that way." Then Blenkiron did an ominous thing. He pulled up a little table and started to lay out patience cards. Since his duodenum was cured, he seemed to have dropped that habit, and from his resuming it I gathered that his mind was uneasy. I can see that scene as if it were yesterday, the French colonel in an armchair smoking a cigarette in a long amber holder, and Blenkiron sitting primly on the edge of a yellow silk ottoman, dealing his cards and looking guiltily towards me. "You'll have Peter for company," he said. "Peter's a sad man, but he has a great heart, and he's been mighty useful to me already. They're going to move him to England very soon. The authorities are afraid of him, for he's apt to talk wild, his health having made him peevish about the British. But there's a deal of red tape in the world, and the orders for his repatriation are slow in coming." The speaker winked very slowly and deliberately with his left eye. I asked if I was to be with Peter, much cheered at the prospect. "Why, yes, you and Peter are the collateral in the deal, but the big game's not with you." I had a presentiment of something coming, something anxious and unpleasant. "Is Mary in it?" I asked. He nodded and seemed to pull himself together for an explanation. "See here, Dick, our main job is to get Ivery back to Allied soil where we can handle him, and there's just the one magnet that can fetch him back. You aren't going to deny that?" I felt my face getting very red, and that ugly hammer began beating in my forehead. Two grave, patient eyes met my glare. "I'm damned if I'll allow it," I said. "I've got some right to a say in the thing. I won't have Mary made a decoy. It's too infernally degrading." "It isn't pretty, but war isn't pretty, and nothing we do is pretty. I'd have blushed like a rose when I was young and innocent to imagine the things I've put my hand to in the last 3 years. But have you any other way, Dick? I'm not proud, and I'll scrap the plan if you can show me another. Night after night I've hammered the thing out, and I can't hit on a better. Hey-ho, Dick, this isn't like you," and he grinned ruefully. "You're making yourself a fine argument in favour of celibacy, in time of war, anyhow. What is it the poet sings? White hands cling to the bridle rein, slipping the spur from the booted heel." I was as angry as sin, but I felt all the time I had no case. Blenkiron stopped his game of patience, sending the cards flying over the carpet, and straddled on the hearthrug. "You're never going to be a piker. What's duty if you won't carry it to the other side of hell? What's the use of yapping about your country if you're going to keep anything back when she calls for it? What's the good of meaning to win the war if you don't put every cent you've got on your stake? You'll make me think you're like the Jacks in your English novels that chuck in their hand and say it's up to God and call that seeing it through. No, Dick, that kind of duty don't deserve a blessing. You dursn't keep back anything if you want to save your soul. Besides," he went on, "what a girl it is. She can't scare and she can't soil. She's white-hot youth and innocence, and she'd take no more harm than clean steel from a muck-heap." I knew I was badly in the wrong, but my pride was all raw. "I'm not going to agree till I've talked to Mary." "But Miss Mary has consented," he said gently. "She made the plan." Next day, in clear blue weather that might have been May, I drove Mary down to Fontainebleau. We lunched in the inn by the bridge and walked into the forest. I hadn't slept much, for I was tortured by what I thought was anxiety for her, but which was in truth jealousy of Ivery. I don't think that I would have minded her risking her life, for that was part of the game we were both in, but I jibbed at the notion of Ivory coming near her again. I told myself it was honourable pride, but I knew deep down in me that it was jealousy. I asked her if she had accepted Blenkiron's plan, and she turned mischievous eyes on me. "I knew I should have a scene with you, Dick. I told Mr. Blenkiron so. Of course I agreed. I'm not even very much afraid of it. I'm a member of the team, you know, and I must play up to my form. I can't do a man's work, so all the more reason why I should tackle the thing I can do." "But," I stammered, it's such a degrading business for a child like you. I can't bear. It makes me hot to think of it." Her reply was merry laughter. "You're an old Ottoman, Dick. You haven't doubled Cape Turk yet, and I don't believe you're round Seraglio Point. Why, women aren't the brittle things men used to think them. They never were, and the war has made them like whipcord. Bless you, my dear, we're the tougher sex now. We've had to wait and endure, and we've been so beaten on the anvil of patience that we've lost all our megrims." She put her hands on my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. "Look at me, Dick. Look at your some day to be espoused saint. I'm 19 years of age next August. Before the war I should have only just put my hair up. I should have been the kind of shivering debutante who blushes when she's spoken to, and oh, I should have thought such silly, silly things about life. Well, in the last 2 years I've been close to it, and to death. I've nursed the dying. I've seen souls in agony and in triumph. England has allowed me to serve her as she allows her sons. Oh, I'm a robust young woman now, and indeed I think women were always robuster than men. Dick, dear Dick, we're lovers, but we're comrades too, always comrades, and comrades trust each other." I hadn't anything to say except contrition, for I had my lesson. I had been slipping away in my thoughts from the gravity of our task, and Mary had brought me back to it. I remember that as we walked through the woodland we came to a place where there were no signs of war. Elsewhere there were men busy felling trees and anti-aircraft guns and an occasional transport wagon, but here there was only a shallow grassy vale, and in the distance bloomed over like a plum in the evening haze the roofs of an old dwelling house among gardens. Mary clung to my arm as we drank in the peace of it. "This is what lies for us at the end of the road, Dick," she said softly. And then, as she looked, I felt her body shiver. She returned to the strange fancy she had had in the Saint-Germain woods 3 days before. "Somewhere it's waiting for us, and we shall certainly find it. But first we must go through the valley of the shadow, and there is the sacrifice to be made, the best of us." Chapter 15. Saranton. 10 days later the porter Joseph Zimmer of Arosa, clad in the tough and shapeless trousers of his class, but sporting an old velveteen shooting coat bequeathed to him by a former German master, speaking the guttural tongue of the Grisons, and with all his belongings in one massive rucksack, came out of the little station of Saranton and blinked in the frosty sunshine. He looked down upon the little old village beside its ice-bound lake, but his business was with the new village of hotels and villas which had sprung up in the last 10 years south of the station. He made some halting inquiries of the station people, and a cab driver outside finally directed him to the place he sought, the cottage of the widow Zummermatter, where resided an English interne, one Peter Pienaar. The porter, Joseph Zimmer, had had a long and roundabout journey. A fortnight before he had worn the uniform of a British Major-General. As such he had been the inmate of an expensive Paris hotel, till one morning in grey tweed clothes and with a limp he had taken the Paris Mediterranean Express with a ticket for an officer's convalescent home at Cannes. Thereafter he had declined in the social scale. At Dijon he had been still an Englishman, but at Pontarlier he had become an American bagman of Swiss parentage, returning to wind up his father's estate. At Berne he limped excessively, and at Zurich, at a little back-street hotel, he became frankly the peasant. For he met a friend there from whom he acquired clothes with that odd rank smell, far stronger than Harris tweed, which marks the raiment of most Swiss guides and all Swiss porters. He also acquired a new name and an old aunt, who a little later received him with open arms and explained to her friends that he was her brother's son from Arosa, who 3 winters ago had hurt his leg wood-cutting and had been discharged from the levy. A kindly Swiss gentleman, as it chanced, had heard of the deserving Joseph, and interested himself to find him employment. The said philanthropist made a hobby of the French and British prisoners returned from Germany, and had in mind an officer, a crabbed South African with a bad leg, who needed a servant. He was, it seemed, an ill-tempered old fellow, who had to be billeted alone, and since he could speak German, he would be happier with a Swiss native. Joseph haggled somewhat over the wages, but on his aunt's advice he accepted the job, and with a very complete set of papers and a store of ready-made reminiscences — it took him some time to swat up the names of the peaks and passes he had traversed — set out for St. Anton, having dispatched beforehand a monstrously ill-spelt letter announcing his coming. He could barely read and write, but he was good at maps, which he had studied carefully, and he noticed with satisfaction that the valley of St. Anton gives easy access to Italy. As he journeyed south, the reflections of that porter would have surprised his fellow travellers in the stuffy third-class carriage. He was thinking of a conversation he had had some days before in a café at Dijon with a young Englishman bound for Modane. We had bumped up against each other by chance in that strange flitting when all went to different places at different times, asking nothing of each other's business. Wake had greeted me rather shamefacedly, and had proposed dinner together. I'm not good at receiving apologies, and Wake's embarrassed me more than they embarrassed him. "I'm a bit of a cad sometimes," he said. "You know, I'm a better fellow than I sounded that night, Hannay." I mumbled something about not talking rot, the conventional phrase. What worried me was that the man was suffering. You could see it in his eyes. But that evening I got nearer Wake than ever before, and he and I became true friends, for he laid bare his soul before me. That was his trouble, that he could lay bare his soul, for ordinary healthy folk don't analyze their feelings. Wake did, and I think it brought him relief. Don't think I was ever your rival. I would no more have proposed to Mary than I would have married one of her aunts. She was so sure of herself, so happy in her single-heartedness, that she terrified me. My type of man is not meant for marriage, for women must be in the centre of life, and we must always be standing aside and looking on. It is a damnable thing to be left-handed. "The trouble about you, my dear chap," I said, "is that you're too hard to please." "That's one way of putting it. I should put it more harshly. I hate more than I love. All we humanitarians and pacifists have hatred as our mainspring. Odd, isn't it, for people who preach brotherly love? But it's the truth. We're full of hate towards everything that doesn't square in with our ideas, everything that jars on our ladylike nerves. Fellows like you are so in love with their cause that they've no time or inclination to detest what thwarts them. We've no cause, only negatives, and that means hatred and self-torture and a beastly jaundice of soul." Then I knew that Wake's fault was not spiritual pride, as I had diagnosed it at Biggleswick. The man was abased with humility. "I see more than other people see," he went on, "and I feel more. That's the curse on me. You're a happy man, and you get things done, because you only see one side of a case, one thing at a time. How would you like it if 1,000 strings were always tugging at you, if you saw that every course meant the sacrifice of lovely and desirable things, or even the shattering of what you know to be unreplaceable? I'm the kind of stuff poets are made of, but I haven't got the poet's gift, so I stagger about the world left-handed and game-legged. Take the war. For me to fight would be worse than for another man to run away. From the bottom of my heart I believe that it needn't have happened, and that all war is a blistering iniquity. And yet belief has got very little to do with virtue. I'm not as good a man as you, Hannay, who have never thought out anything in your life. My time in the Labour Battalion taught me something. I knew that with all my fine aspirations I wasn't as true a man as fellows whose talk was silly oaths and who didn't care a tinker's curse about their soul." I remember that I looked at him with a sudden understanding. "I think I know you. You're the sort of chap who won't fight for his country because he can't be sure that she's altogether in the right, but he'd cheerfully die for her, right or wrong." His face relaxed in a slow smile. "Queer that you should say that." I think it's pretty near the truth. Men like me aren't afraid to die, but they haven't quite the courage to live. Every man should be happy in a service like you when he obeys orders. I couldn't get on in any service. I lack the bump of veneration. I can't swallow things merely because I'm told to. My sort are always talking about service, but we haven't the temperament to serve. I'd give all I have to be an ordinary cog in the wheel instead of a confounded outsider who finds fault with the machinery. Take a great, violent, high-handed fellow like you. You can sink yourself till you become only a name and a number. I couldn't if I tried. I'm not sure I want to either. I cling to the odds and ends that are my own. I wish I had had you in my battalion a year ago, I said. No, you don't. I'd only have been a nuisance. I've been a Fabian since Oxford, but you're a better socialist than me. I'm a rancid individualist. But you must be feeling better about the war, I asked. Not a bit of it. I'm still lusting for the heads of the politicians that made it and continue it. But I want to help my country. Honestly, Hannay, I love the old place. More, I think, than I love myself, and that's saying a devilish lot. Short of fighting, which would be to sin against the Holy Spirit for me, I'll do my damnedest. But you'll remember I'm not used to teamwork. If I'm a jealous player, beat me over the head. His voice was almost wistful, and I liked him enormously. Blenkiron will see to that, I said. We're going to break you to harness, Wake, and then you'll be a happy man. You keep your mind on the game and forget about yourself. That's the cure for jibbers. As I journeyed to St. Anton, I thought a lot about that talk. He was quite right about Mary, who would never have married him. A man with such an angular soul couldn't fit into another's. And then I thought that the chief thing about Mary was just her serene certainty. Her eyes had that settled, happy look that I remembered to have seen only in one other human face, and that was Peter's. But I wondered if Peter's eyes were still the same. I found the cottage, a little wooden thing which had been left perched on its knoll when the big hotels grew around it. It had a fence in front, but behind it was open to the hillside. At the gate stood a bent old woman with a face like a pippin. My make-up must have been good, for she accepted me before I introduced myself. "God be thanked you are come," she cried. "The poor lieutenant needed a man to keep him company. He sleeps now, as he does always in the afternoon, for his leg wearies him in the night. But he is brave, like a soldier. Come, I will show you the house, for you two will be alone now." Stepping softly, she led me indoors, pointing with a warning finger to the little bedroom where Peter slept. I found a kitchen with a big stove and a rough floor of planking, on which lay some badly cured skins. Off it was a sort of pantry with a bed for me. She showed me the pots and pans for cooking, and the stores she had laid in, and where to find water and fuel. "I will do the marketing daily," she said, "and if you need me, my dwelling is 1/2 mile up the road beyond the new church. God be with you, young man, and be kind to that wounded one." When the widow Zumamata had departed, I sat down in Peter's armchair and took stock of the place. It was quiet and simple and homely, and through the window came the gleam of snow on the diamond hills. On the table beside the stove were Peter's cherished belongings, his buckskin pouch and the pipe which Janny Grobelaar had carved for him in St. Helena, an aluminium field matchbox I had given him, a cheap large print Bible such as padres present to well-disposed privates, and an old battered Pilgrim's Progress with gaudy pictures. The illustration at which I opened showed Faithful going up to heaven from the fire of Vanity Fair like a woodcock that has just been flushed. Everything in the room was exquisitely neat, and I knew that that was Peter and not the widow Zumamata. On a peg behind the door hung his much-mended coat, and sticking out of a pocket I recognized a sheaf of my own letters. In one corner stood something which I had forgotten about, an invalid chair. The sight of Peter's plain little oddments made me feel solemn. I wondered if his eyes would be like Mary's now, for I could not conceive what life would be for him as a cripple. Very silently I opened the bedroom door and slipped inside. He was lying on a camp bedstead with one of those striped Swiss blankets pulled up round his ears, and he was asleep. It was the old Peter beyond doubt. He had the hunter's gift of breathing evenly through his nose, and the white scar on the deep brown of his forehead was what I had always remembered. The only change since I last saw him was that he had let his beard grow again, and it was grey. As I looked at him, the remembrance of all we had been through together flooded back upon me, and I could have cried with joy at being beside him. Women, bless their hearts, can never know what long comradeship means to men. It is something not in their lives, something that belongs only to that wild, undomesticated world which we forswear when we find our mates. Even Mary understood only a bit of it. I had just won her love, which was the greatest thing that ever came my way, but if she had entered at that moment, I would scarcely have turned my head. I was back again in the old life, and was not thinking of the new. Suddenly I saw that Peter was awake and was looking at me. "Dick," he said in a whisper, "Dick, my old friend." The blanket was tossed off, and his long, lean arms were stretched out to me. I gripped his hands, and for a little we did not speak. Then I saw how woefully he had changed. His left leg had shrunk, and from the knee down was like a pipe stem. His face, when awake, showed the lines of hard suffering, and he seemed shorter by half a foot. But his eyes were still like Mary's. Indeed, they seemed to be more patient and peaceful than in the days when he sat beside me on the buck wagon and peered over the hunting veldt. I picked him up, he was no heavier than Mary, and carried him to his chair beside the stove. Then I boiled water and made tea, as we had so often done together. "Peter, old man," I said, "we're on trek again, and this is a very snug little rendezvous. We've had many good yarns, but this is going to be the best. First of all, how about your health?" "Good. I'm a strong man again, but slow, like a hippo cow. I have been lonely sometimes, but that is all by now. Tell me of the big battles." But I was hungry for news of him, and kept him to his own case. He had no complaint of his treatment, except that he did not like Germans. The doctors at the hospital had been clever, he said, and had done their best for him, but nerves and sinews and small bones had been so wrecked that they could not mend his leg, and Peter had all the Boers' dislike of amputation. One doctor had been in Damaraland and talked to him of those baked sunny places and made him homesick, but he returned always to his dislike of Germans. He had seen them herding our soldiers like brute beasts, and the commandant had a face like Stumm and a chin that stuck out and wanted hitting. He made an exception for the great airman Lensch, who had downed him. "He is a white man, that one," he said. "He came to see me in hospital and told me a lot of things. I think he made them treat me well. He is a big man, Dick, who would make two of me, and he has a round, merry face and pale eyes like Fricky Selliers, who could put a bullet through a paw's head at 200 yards. He said he was sorry I was lame, for he hoped to have more fights with me. Some woman that tells fortunes had said that I would be the end of him, but he reckoned she had got the thing the wrong way on. I hope he will come through this war, for he is a good man, though a German. But the others, they are like the fool in the Bible, fat and ugly in good fortune, and proud and vicious when their luck goes. They are not a people to be happy with." Then he told me that to keep his spirits he had amused himself with playing a game. He had prided himself on being a Boer, and spoke coldly of the British. He had also, I gathered, imparted many things calculated to deceive. So he left Germany with good marks, and at Switzerland had held himself aloof from the other British wounded on the advice of Blenkiron, who had met him as soon as he crossed the frontier. I gathered it was Blenkiron who had had him sent to Saint-Anton, and in his time there, as a disgruntled Boer, he had mixed a good deal with Germans. They had pumped him about our air service, and Peter had told them many ingenious lies and heard curious things in return. "They are working hard, Dick," he said. "Never forget that. The German is a stout enemy, and when we beat him with a machine he sweats till he has invented a new one. They have great pilots, but never so many good ones as we, and I do not think in ordinary fighting they can ever beat us. But you must watch Lensch, for I fear him. He has a new machine, I hear, with great engines and a short wing spread, but the wings so cambered that he can climb fast. That will be a surprise to spring upon us. You will say that we'll soon better it. So we shall, but if it was used at a time when we were pushing hard, it might make the little difference that loses battles." "You mean," I said, "that if we had a great attack ready, and had driven all the Boche planes back from our front, Lensch and his circus might get over in spite of us and blow the gaff?" "Yes," he said solemnly. "Or if we were attacked and had a weak spot, Lensch might show the Germans where to get through. I do not think we are going to attack for a long time, but I am pretty sure that Germany is going to fling every man against us. That is the talk of my friends, and it is not bluff." That night I cooked our modest dinner, and we smoked our pipes with the stove door open and the good smell of wood smoke in our nostrils. I told him of all my doings and of the wild birds and ivory and the job we were engaged on. Blenkiron's instructions were that we too should live humbly and keep our eyes and ears open, for we were outside suspicion, the cantankerous lame Boer and his loutish servant from Arosa. Somewhere in the place was a rendezvous of our enemies, and thither came Chelius on his dark errands. Peter nodded his head sagely. "I think I have guessed the place. The daughter of the old woman used to pull my chair sometimes down to the village, and I have sat in cheap inns and talked to servants. There is a fresh water pan there. It is all covered with snow now, and beside it there is a big house that they call the Pink Chalet. I do not know much about it, except that rich folk live in it, for I know the other houses, and they are harmless. Also the big hotels, which are too cold and public for strangers to meet in." I put Peter to bed, and it was a joy to me to look after him, to give him his tonic and prepare the hot water bottle that comforted his neuralgia. His behaviour was like a docile child's, and he never lapsed from his sunny temper, though I could see how his leg gave him hell. They had tried massage for it and had given up, and there was nothing for him but to endure till nature and his tough constitution deadened the tortured nerves again. I shifted my bed out of the pantry and slept in the room with him, and when I woke in the night, as one does the first time in a strange place, I could tell by his breathing that he was wakeful and suffering. Next day a bath chair containing a grizzled cripple and pushed by a limping peasant might have been seen descending the long hill to the village. It was clear frosty weather, which makes the cheeks tingle, and I felt so full of beans that it was hard to remember my game leg. The valley was shut in on the east by a great mass of rocks and glaciers, belonging to a mountain whose top could not be seen. But on the south, above the snowy fir woods, there was a most delicate lace-like peak with a point like a needle. I looked at it with interest, for beyond it lay the valley which led to the Staub Pass, and beyond that was Italy and Mary. The old village of St. Anton had one long narrow street which bent at right angles to a bridge which spanned the river flowing from the lake. Thence the road climbed steeply, but at the other end of the street it ran on the level by the water's edge, lined with gimcrack boarding houses now shuttered to the world, and a few villas and patches of garden. At the far end, just before it plunged into a pine wood, a promontory jutted into the lake, leaving a broad space between the road and the water. Here were the grounds of a more considerable dwelling, snow-covered laurels and rhododendrons, with one or two bigger trees, and just on the water edge stood the house itself, called the Pink Chalet. I wheeled Peter past the entrance on the crackling snow of the highway. Seen through the gaps of the trees, the front looked new, but the back part seemed to be of some age, for I could see high walls, broken by few windows, hanging over the water. The place was no more a chalet than a dungeon, but I suppose the name was given in honour of a wooden gallery above the front door. The whole thing was washed in an ugly pink. There were outhouses, garage or stables among the trees, and at the entrance there were fairly recent tracks of an automobile. On our way back we had some very bad beer in a café and made friends with the woman who kept it. Peter had to tell her his story, and I trotted out my aunt in Zurich, and in the end we heard her grievances. She was a true Swiss, angry at all the belligerents who had spoiled their livelihood, hating Germany most, but also fearing her most. Coffee, tea, fuel, bread, even milk and cheese were hard to get and cost a ransom. It would take the land years to recover, and there would be no more tourists, for there was little money left in the world. I dropped a question about the Pink Chalet, and was told that it belonged to one Schweigler, a professor of Bern, an old man who came sometimes for a few days in the summer. It was often let, but not now. Asked if it was occupied, she remarked that some friends of the Schweiglers, rich people from Basel, had been there for the winter. They come and go in great cars, she said bitterly, and they bring their food from the cities. They spend no money in this poor place. Presently Peter and I fell into a routine of life, as if we had always kept house together. In the morning he went abroad in his chair, and in the afternoon I would hobble about on my own errands. We sank into the background and took its colour, and a less conspicuous pair never faced the eye of suspicion. Once a week a young Swiss officer, whose business it was to look after British wounded, paid us a hurried visit. I used to get letters from my aunt in Zurich, and sometimes with the postmark of a Rosa, and now and then these letters would contain curiously worded advice or instructions from him whom my aunt called the kind patron. Generally I was told to be patient. Sometimes I had a word about the health of my little cousin across the mountains. Once I was bidden expect a friend of the patron's, the wise doctor of whom he had often spoken, but though after that I shadowed the Pink Chalet for 2 days, no doctor appeared. My investigations were a barren business. I used to go down to the village in the afternoon and sit in an out-of-the-way café, talking slow German with peasants and hotel porters, but there was little to learn. I knew all there was to hear about the Pink Chalet, and that was nothing. A young man who skied stayed for 3 nights and spent his days on the Alps above the fir woods. A party of 4, including 2 women, were reported to have been there for a night, all ramifications of the rich family of Basel. I studied the house from the lake, which should have been nicely swept into ice rinks, but from lack of visitors was a heap of blown snow. The high old walls of the back part were built straight from the water's edge. I remember I tried a short cut through the grounds to the high road and was given good afternoon by a smiling German manservant. One way and another I gathered there were a good many serving men about the place, too many for the infrequent guests. But beyond this I discovered nothing. Not that I was bored, for I had always Peter to turn to. He was thinking a lot about South Africa, and the thing he liked best was to go over with me every detail of our old expeditions. They belonged to a life which he could think about without pain, whereas the war was too near and bitter for him. He liked to hobble out of doors after the darkness came and look at his old friends, the stars. He called them by the words they use on the veldt, and the first star of morning he called the voorloper, the little boy who inspans the oxen, a name I had not heard for 20 years. Many a great yarn was spun in the long evenings, but I always went to bed with a sore heart. The longing in his eyes was too urgent, longing not for old days or far countries, but for the health and strength which had once been his pride. One night I told him about Mary. "She will be a happy mizzy," he said, "but you will need to be very clever with her, for women are queer cattle, and you and I don't know their ways. They tell me English women do not cook and make clothes like our vrouws, so what will she find to do? I doubt an idle woman will be like a mealy-fed horse." It was no good explaining to him the kind of girl Mary was, for that was a world entirely beyond his ken. But I could see that he felt lonelier than ever at my news. So I told him of the house I meant to have in England when the war was over, an old house in a green hilly country, with fields that would carry 4 head of cattle to the morgen, and furrows of clear water, and orchards of plums and apples. "And you will stay with us all the time," I said. "You will have your own rooms and your own boy to look after you, and you will help me to farm, and we will catch fish together, and shoot the wild ducks when they come up from the pans in the evening. I have found a better countryside than the Houtbosch, where you and I plan to have a farm. It is a blessed and happy place, England." He shook his head. "You are a kind man, Dick, but your pretty Missy won't want an ugly old fellow like me hobbling about her house. I do not think I will get back to Africa, for I should be sad there in the sun. I will find a little place in England, and some day I will visit you, old friend." That night his stoicism seemed for the first time to fail him. He was silent for a long time and went early to bed, where I can vouch for it he did not sleep. But he must have thought a lot in the night time, for in the morning he had got himself in hand and was as cheerful as a sandboy. I watched his philosophy with amazement. It was far beyond anything I could have compassed myself. He was so frail and so poor, for he had never had anything in the world but his bodily fitness, and he had lost that now. And remember, he had lost it after some months of glittering happiness, for in the air he had found the element for which he had been born. Sometimes he dropped a hint of those days when he lived in the clouds and invented a new kind of battle, and his voice always grew hoarse. I could see that he ached with longing for their return, and yet he never had a word of complaint. That was the ritual he had set himself, his point of honour, and he faced the future with the same kind of courage as that with which he had tackled a wild beast or Lensch himself. Only it needed a far bigger brand of fortitude. Another thing was that he had found religion. I doubt if that is the right way to put it, for he had always had it. Men who live in the wilds know they are in the hands of God. But his old kind had been a tattered thing, more like heathen superstition, though it had always kept him humble. But now he had taken to reading the Bible, and to thinking in his lonely nights, and he had got a creed of his own. I dare say it was crude enough. I am sure it was unorthodox. But if the proof of religion is that it gives a man a prop in bad days, then Peter's was the real thing. He used to ferret about in the Bible and the Pilgrim's Progress, they were both equally inspired in his eyes, and find texts which he interpreted in his own way to meet his case. He took everything quite literally. What happened 3,000 years ago in Palestine might, for all he minded, have been going on next door. I used to chaff him and tell him that he was like the Kaiser, very good at fitting the Bible to his purpose, but his sincerity was so complete that he only smiled. I remember one night when he had been thinking about his flying days, he found a passage in Thessalonians about the dead rising to meet their Lord in the air, and that cheered him a lot. Peter, I could see, had the notion that his time here wouldn't be very long, and he liked to think that when he got his release he would find once more the old rapture. Once, when I said something about his patience, he said he had got to try to live up to Mr. Standfast. He had fixed on that character to follow, though he would have preferred Mr. Valiant for truth if he thought himself good enough. He used to talk about Mr. Standfast in his queer way, as if he were a friend of us both, like Blenkiron. I tell you, I was humbled out of all my pride by the sight of Peter, so uncomplaining and gentle and wise. The Almighty himself couldn't have made a prig out of him, and he never would have thought of preaching. Only once did he give me advice. I had always a liking for short-cuts, and I was getting a bit restive under the long inaction. One day, when I expressed my feelings on the matter, Peter upped and read from the Pilgrim's Progress. Some also have wished that the next way to their Father's house was here, that they might be troubled no more with either hills or mountains to go over, but the way is the way, and there is an end. All the same, when we got into March and nothing happened, I grew pretty anxious. Blenkiron had said we were fighting against time, and here were the weeks slipping away. His letters came occasionally, always in the shape of communications from my aunt. One told me that I would soon be out of a job, for Peter's repatriation was just about through, and he might get his movement order any day. Another spoke of my little cousin over the hills, and said that she hoped soon to be going to a place called Santa Chiara in the Val Saluzzana. I got out the map in a hurry and measured the distance from there to San Anton, and pored over the two roads thither, the short one by the Staub Pass and the long one by the Mariolana. These letters made me think that things were nearing a climax, but still no instructions came. I had nothing to report in my own messages. I had discovered nothing in the Pink Chalet but idle servants. I was not even sure if the Pink Chalet were a harmless villa, and I hadn't come within 1,000 miles of finding Chelius. All my desire to imitate Peter's stoicism didn't prevent me from getting occasionally rattled and despondent. The one thing I could do was to keep fit, for I had a notion I might soon want all my bodily strength. I had to keep up my pretense of lameness in the daytime, so I used to take my exercise at night. I would sleep in the afternoon when Peter had his siesta, and then about 10 in the evening, after putting him to bed, I would slip out of doors and go for a 4 or 5 hours tramp. Wonderful were those midnight wanderings. I pushed up through the snow-laden pines to the ridges where the snow lay in great wreaths and scallops, till I stood on a crest with the frozen world at my feet, and above me a host of glittering stars. Once, on a night of full moon, I reached the glacier at the valley head, scrambled up the moraine to where the ice began, and peered fearfully into the spectral crevasses. At such hours I had the earth to myself, for there was not a sound except the slipping of a burden of snow from the trees, or the crack and rustle which reminded me that a glacier was a moving river. The war seemed very far away, and I felt the littleness of our human struggles, till I thought of Peter turning from side to side to find ease in the cottage far below me. Then I realized that the spirit of man was the greatest thing in this spacious world. I would get back about 3 or 4, have a bath in the water which had been warming in my absence, and creep into bed, almost ashamed of having 2 sound legs, when a better man a yard away had but one. Oddly enough, at these hours there seemed more life in the pink chalet than by day. Once, tramping across the lake long after midnight, I saw lights in the lake front, in windows which for ordinary were blank and shuttered. Several times I cut across the grounds when the moon was dark. On one such occasion a great car with no lights swept up the drive, and I heard low voices at the door. Another time a man ran hastily past me and entered the house by a little door on the eastern side, which I had not before noticed. Slowly the conviction began to grow on me that we were not wrong in marking down this place, that things went on within it which it deeply concerned us to discover. But I was puzzled to think of a way. I might butt inside, but for all I knew it would be upsetting Blenkiron's plans, for he had given me no instructions about housebreaking. All this unsettled me worse than ever. I began to lie awake, planning some means of entrance. I would be a peasant from the next valley who had twisted his ankle. I would go seeking an imaginary cousin among the servants. I would start a fire in the place and have the doors flung open to zealous neighbours. And then suddenly I got instructions in a letter from Blenkiron. It came inside a parcel of warm socks that arrived from my kind aunt. But the letter for me was not from her. It was in Blenkiron's large, sprawling hand, and the style of it was all his own. He told me that he had about finished his job. He had got his line on Chelius, who was the bird he expected, and that bird would soon wing its way southward across the mountains for the reason I knew of. "We've got an almighty move on," he wrote, "and please God you're going to hustle some in the next week. It's going better than I ever hoped." But something was still to be done. He had struck a countryman, one Clarence Dunn, a journalist of Kansas City, whom he had taken into the business. Him he described as a crackerjack and commended to my esteem. He was coming to San Antone, for there was a game afoot at the Pink Chalet which he would give me news of. I was to meet him next evening at 9:15 at the little door in the east end of the house. "For the love of Mike, Dick," he concluded, "be on time and do everything Clarence tells you as if he was me. It's a mighty complex affair, but you and he have sand enough to pull through. Don't worry about your little cousin. She's safe and out of the job now." My first feeling was one of immense relief, especially at the last words. I read the letter a dozen times to make sure I had its meaning. A flash of suspicion crossed my mind that it might be a fake, principally because there was no mention of Peter, who had figured large in the other missives. But why should Peter be mentioned when he wasn't on in this piece? The signature convinced me. Ordinarily Blenkiron signed himself in full, with a fine commercial flourish. But when I was at the front he had got into the habit of making a kind of hieroglyphic of his surname to me and sticking J.S. after it in a bracket. That was how this letter was signed, and it was sure proof it was all right. I spent that day and the next in wild spirits. Peter spotted what was on, though I did not tell him for fear of making him envious. I had to be extra kind to him, for I could see that he ached to have a hand in the business. Indeed, he asked shyly if I couldn't fit him in, and I had to lie about it and say it was only another of my aimless circumnavigations of the pink chalet. "Try and find me something where I can help," he pleaded. "I'm pretty strong still, though I'm lame, and I can shoot a bit." I declared that he would be used in time, that Blenkiron had promised he would be used, but for the life of me I couldn't see how. At 9 o'clock on the evening appointed, I was on the lake opposite the house, close in under the shore, making my way to the rendezvous. It was a coal black night, for though the air was clear, the stars were shining with a little light, and the moon had not yet risen. With a premonition that I might be long away from food, I had brought some slabs of chocolate, and my pistol and torch were in my pocket. It was bitter cold, but I had ceased to mind weather, and I wore my one suit and no overcoat. The house was like a tomb for silence. There was no crack of light anywhere, and none of those smells of smoke and food which proclaim habitation. It was an eerie job scrambling up the steep bank east of the place to where the flat of the garden started in a darkness so great that I had to grope my way like a blind man. I found the little door by feeling along the edge of the building. Then I stepped into an adjacent clump of laurels to wait on my companion. He was there before me. "Say," I heard a rich Middle West voice whisper, "are you Joseph Zimmer? I'm not shouting any names, but I guess you are the guy I was told to meet here." "Mr. Dunn?" I whispered back. "The same," he replied. "Shake." I gripped a gloved and mittened hand which drew me towards the door.